Morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Oh, that's not going to work. It's not going to work. Okay, we made it. And we're just getting rolling. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to shift to my computer specs. Okay, today's lesson is written by Lev Kagai, uh, who is a Russian Jungian analyst. And I'm going to read. I'm reading today from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arst. And of course, you all know that, having been here before, but I'm just getting my screen set up. Excuse me, just a minute. Okay, Lev Kagai is a Jungian analyst, graduated from Moscow State University in 1991 and received analytical training through the IAAP program in Russia. He is a founding member and training analyst of Russian Society for Analytical Psychology, assistant professor at the Moscow Institute of Psychoanalysis, and has a private practice in Moscow. He has lectured widely throughout Russia and post-Soviet countries. His special interest is a Jungian view on religion, spirituality, philosophy, and culture. He has several publications in Russian. So that is Mr. Kagai. And so today is the second half of our discussion of his essay on Jung's Red Book for Our Time, or Jung's Red Book itself. And let me clean up my appearance here a little bit. And let's see. Okay. So we're on page 286. This is volume 2 of Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. I've shown it to you a moment ago. And here, this is called The Dionysian Element. Vyacheslav Ivanov organized gatherings of symbolists in his so-called tower, a round corner room on the top floor of his house in St. Petersburg. This tower has direct parallels with Jung's tower on the Lake of Zurich in Bollingen, the building behind me. And there's the tower. Ivanov was the main Russian researcher on the cult of Dionysus in Greece and an advocate of the Dionysian element in art. In this respect, he was influenced by Nietzsche. He understood symbolism as a literary trend that uses universal mythological motifs, among which he considered the religious themes of death and rebirth, sacrifice on the way to spiritual transformation, and mystical love conquering death to be the most important. Symbolic art for him is born from the archetypal layer of the collective soul and must possess a mysterious power, creating numinous experiences. Dionysus is born twice, as a man and as a deity. He is a suffering god, torn to pieces and reborn again. That is why he is the deity of initiation, of mystery, of healing, and therefore of any work in the genre of drama or tragedy. Such Dionysian energies permeate Jung's entire Red Book. By experiencing classical and personal mythological themes, Jung goes through a great deal of suffering and frequently finds new meaning in it. Several times in his visions, he goes into the desert and even descends to hell like Orpheus, Dionysius, and Jesus. He also hangs in a tree like Odin. One can say that Jung's image of the self was either Dionysian, Orphic, or Mithraic. He even switches to the language of a poetic anthem imitating ancient poetry, which Vyacheslav, Ivanov loves so much that he describes the rebirth of God from an egg and refers to the Orphic Phanes, who was identified with the first Dionysius, or Dionysius Zagreus. Jung's friend Carl Carigny wrote a famous book titled Dionysius, the Prototype of Inexhaustible Life. Dionysius is the spirit of life itself, not just one of the archetypes, but their origin, the basic element of any psychological structure. Therefore, any movement, any change in the psyche cannot do without the involvement of Dionysius. At the end of the Red Book, choosing the path of life and not the path of love, Jung gives priority to Dionysius over Christ, preferring the primary to the secondary, choosing the eternal basis from which all forms are continuously generated. Ivanov relied not only on intellectual searching, but also on his personal visionary and spiritual experiences. Another source of his inspiration was the people's reform movements within Russian Orthodoxy. According to some estimates, up to 1 million people in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century were involved in Klisti, uh, which is spelled Khlysty, which was how various sectarian movements were defined in official reports. They had some resemblance with the flagellants. The popular practice of these sects was to create exciting rituals with music, singing, and dancing, whose purpose was to induce ecstatic states. In this process, Jesus, the Mother of God, or the Holy Spirit, supposedly settles uh, in the most gifted adepts. In this capacity, they gave instructions to the flock, and sometimes the rituals ended with sexual orgies, which were intended to remove the contradictions between the spirit and the flesh. The Dionysian character of such practices was obvious. The Russian symbolists were familiar with Khlysti. In any case, they invited their religious leaders to carry out the rituals. The liberation of Eros was a common theme in symbolist circles and psychoanalysis, which ensured their attraction to each other. Not only Berdyaev, but also Ivanov and uh, Slavtsev. Sorry about the pronunciations. I'm not schooled in Russian. Studied Jung in a most detailed way. Ivanov's other companions, Lev Shestov, the Russian existentialist philosopher who was called the Russian Nietzsche, while in emigration became a friend of Max Edinger, a Russian who in 1909 defended his medical thesis in Zurich, where he met Jung and joined the psychoanalytic movement. Edinger became an important figure in Freud's circle, and in 1925 headed the International Psychoanalytic Association, having done much for publishing the works of the master. This attempt to combine the spiritual search of the intellectual elite with the people's search for religious renewal resembles the episode in the Red Book where Jung meets the phantom of the Anabaptists. This sect was very similar to the Russian Christi. The Anabaptists were radical Protestants in the 16th century who, among other things, advocated baptism in adulthood. That is a conscious coming to faith. They were especially active in Switzerland, not far from Kusnacht, where Jung lived. Therefore, Jung felt a special connection with them. Their interpretation of true Christianity as implying the collectivization of property in the community of wives can be understood only now through the events of the 20th century with its social and sexual revolutions. In the 16th century, their initiatives were brutally suppressed, seeking a way out of the spiritual crisis with the formula of personal salvation. They developed cultural forms for the economic and family life of society, too innovative for their time, but at the same time ancient and originating from the antique Dionysian layer of the collective unconscious. This paradox of modernistic initiatives is sometimes called archaeomodernism, offering the new, they in fact want to return to the old. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a moment because there's a new sub chapter here, but I wanted to just see how everyone is faring in the audience. And Rasputin, I'm sure. Good morning, Cherie, and everyone. I did watch last week's episode. Well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. Uh, Art, I'm so sorry to hear you have a runny nose. I am glad you are far from me, however, because I would prefer not to be sick these days. And in in our school, whenever kids come in with sniffles, we try to send them home pretty quickly these days because we've just come out of about 3 years ago, the COVID crisis, which was not fun in teaching for sure. And I'm glad I started teaching after that. Okay, so did everybody enjoy the Dionysian piece of that? Certainly, it's certainly true that sexuality is part of our spiritual life, and um, it's best to understand it and manage it properly. Um, in order to avoid heartache, I would say. I think that basically the fundamentalists have persuaded uh, particularly young women to throw away their marriages on the first sign of infidelity by their husbands. And I think, from my perspective, it is best to have the argument and then never speak of it again. And at the same time, do your best to stay in your marriage, because uh, there are a lot of good things in marriage, and um, perfect fidelity in a species that doesn't um, psychologically believe in fidelity per se, except in religious the religious context. It used to be in law, but we've pretty much gone away from that. But it's not very wise to give up a marriage just because there's a moment of infidelity. It's better to be sadder and wiser and work it out with your spouse. Cherie says, um, my sparrow did not have a broken wing. It slept on my chest, and the next day we let it fly in its spirit in the sky. That's what Cherie says. Um, and And she says, Kathy says, young Ian. I don't know what that's a reference to. More accurately, Jungian references by others. Um, as most of you know, Jung lived in a menage a trois for about 40 years, quite openly. And, I can't say what happened at Tony Wolf's house every Wednesday afternoon when he went to visit her. Um, uh, Emma Jung said she was thankful that Tony was able to carry Jung through his crisis period, uh, which is the Red Book period that we're referring to here. And she was always grateful to Tony Wolf for that. Um, and they pretty much traveled as a family of three, plus all of Jung and Carl and Emma's children. Um, and and Tony Wolf became a kind of favored auntie who came over every Sunday for dinner type thing. They worked together a lot. Marie-Louise von France um, was asked by Jung to finalize Emma Jung's Grail Legend book, which is a wonderful, very interesting book. If you get a chance, you can get it from Amazon, which is called The Grail Legend, and it teaches us a lot. What we know is that the Knights of the Round Table always entered the forest at its deepest point. And of course, that's a metaphor, um, because or at its darkest point, I mean, not deepest, but it probably is also the deepest. Um, we in the state of Maryland, we still have very, very thick forests in some parts of the state. And even within 5 miles of my city, Annapolis, which has always been the capital of Maryland, um, the forest is really quite thick, and you have to marvel at what it took for the European settlers to um, settle North America, especially on the East Coast, because um, it was just very thickly forested and triple canopy, sort of jungle, and so the forests had to be cleared, and that was all done with hand tools in those days. And so, uh, the reference to the deep forest is very meaningful, certainly to me. And I expect if you live in places like uh, Thomas Arst, you did before his death, he lived in the Black Forest, so called because it's so thick with forest that it seems black in some parts. Um, And Art says, why do some Christians think sex is sinful when God made us sexual people? Well, Art, I think the reasons for that are um, societal, not necessarily religious, or not with religious basis, although they used those excuses. Um, because obviously there was lots of adultery in the Bible, including um, Abraham, who was the founder of the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, um, lived in a menage a trois with his wife Sarah, who could not bear children, and Hagar, their slave, who was an Arab um, woman who lived in the household, presumably, because um, when we think of the story of uh, Isaac and the saving of Isaac from sacrifice by Abraham, um, Isaac was not the firstborn child. The firstborn child was Ishmael, and the way the story went, um, Sarah couldn't have children, so she uh, persuaded Abraham to uh, have his son by Sarah, and uh, and then, as often happens, I think, in these sorts of situations, as soon as uh, Hagar became pregnant, so became Sarah pregnant. And Ishmael was born first and was actually the first son of Abraham. But uh, Sarah banished Hagar into the wilderness, and all of Islam is really based on this story that the Hajj, the so-called Hajj, and the uh, the obligation of Muslims to go to Mecca uh, is, in the very basis of Islam, and uh, and many of the events that are portrayed during the Hajj, for example, throwing of stones at the devil and that sort of thing, um, all were events in Hagar's life. And Hagar struggled to go out into the desert with her son Ishmael, and and finally they found water. They found a well, And what many people don't know is that the Kaaba, which is the holy place of Islam, and toward which every Muslim faces if they can 5 times a day for prayer, the Kaaba is actually a well. And it was actually a well that um, God gave Sarah when she was in extremis during her escape away from Abraham. And uh, and to this day, there is water in that well. And if you go into the Middle East, it's very common to see people with 5-gallon clear jerry cans of water, and it's water from that well. And they frequently carry it home to other Muslim countries like India. So I've, on many occasions, traveling from Saudi Arabia to India, on many occasions, I've seen in baggage claim, there'll be all these jerry cans, these 5-gallon cans made of heavy plastic of some sort um, in on the turntable in the baggage claim, and that's Muslim people taking water home from that holy well. It's very meaningful to them when they do so. And so all of it, Islam uh, has its origins from that time. And that was a time that was, I don't know, about 1,000 years before Christ, something like that. Um, I don't remember exactly the time of Abraham, um, but the Quran, which was written by the Prophet in about 640 AD, was actually, peace be upon him, was actually written more than 1,500 or 1,600 years after the time of Abraham. And many of the stories that are in the Quran are also in the Old Testament of the Bible, slightly, slightly altered, but many people don't understand that and how closely aligned the two religions really are, and also especially Judaism. Um, so, um, Deborah says, Skip, I have cybersecurity issues, ATM, so I couldn't go to the other group. Sorry about that. Um, I guess we're all carrying that particular cross for the rest of our lives because children with not enough to do think it's fun to destroy the international communication system. So anyway, um, and they keep playing with it. And that's been going on ever since they could, which is about 40 years now. You know. So I'm not quite sure, Archiphanes, what your reference is to the three men who stood by him. And but in any case, of course, then Isaac, which traditionally in Sunday school is taught as Abraham's oldest son, and we would have to say Abraham's only son by his wife, or his first son by Sarah, um, was not um, sacrificed. And my friends who are Jewish, um, my rabbi friend, Steve Fuchs, who I've interviewed on this channel, and has written a book on this topic, or the topic of the Torah, for people who need to understand it better. He says that that was the end of human sacrifice. Well, let's say that at least in what we call the Western world, that was the end. I don't think I've ever seen quite a matching up of like Aztec and other timelines to understand when human sacrifice ended in those areas, or in China, for example, where if the emperor died, the empress and all the other concubines and all their attendants would be sealed in the tomb, and that would be that. And 2,000 years later, when they opened those tombs, they found them still in pretty good condition, although as soon as oxygen was let into the tombs, they disintegrated very quickly. And there was a fascinating story about the parallels of the traditions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, very definitely. When I first went to Saudi Arabia at that time, which was in 2003, or I'm sorry, 2002, because 9/11 occurred in September of 2001, and it happened that 9 months later, I had an invitation to visit Saudi Arabia, and I went very apprehensively, as one might expect, for Western people who have just a normal sort of semi-plain vanilla American background, to go into Saudi Arabia. I looked at it across the river or the sea from Bahrain a couple of times. There's a causeway that goes out across from Bahrain to Saudi Arabia, and so I had seen it, but I hadn't been in it. And so that first trip was quite interesting. And one of the things that I'll tell you a funny story and an interesting story. The funny story is that I was picked up by a colleague who was driving a red Mercedes, and he was talking about his ethnic background and said, "We are Bedouin." I said, "Oh yeah. When was the last time you rode a camel?" But you do see camels quite regularly in Saudi Arabia. That was one story. And let's see, slipped my mind of the other one that I was going to tell. Maybe I'll think of it. So Archimedes says Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are able to claim the title of forerunners to these other faiths over any prophet. And I'll get to the other question, but obviously well, I'm getting old because I'm not connecting up everything I want to say. But the priestesses of Greece used to sit next to this emanation of gases coming up from the earth, and they used to get into a state and prophesy, and that was all in the time of Socrates and Plato and that sort of thing. And so, yes, they existed before. And Richard says, sex is not sinful when it's practiced in marriage. It's part of the covenant with God. And then Archiphanes says, why are Zoroastrians persecuted by Islam if they both believe in one God? Well, the Zoroastrians, as I understand it, were fire and sun worshippers, and Islam believed in one God, of course, Allah, and people, 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, human beings were not very smart or wise, although some were, of course, but we hadn't grown up enough to realize that we shouldn't be warring in the physical world over our religions. And we still haven't grown up enough to realize that today in many parts of the world, including in the United States. And so we still do have religious strife, which is quite shocking and not necessary. And it's just a way for people in politics and power brokers to control the people and control women, especially. And so, you know, that's why we're still ingenues. We're still teenagers in the development of our species, and we have to grow up and get beyond our middle school type of attitude about one another. That's clear. And so who were the easiest examples of alchemy? Asked Cherie. And Deborah says, making chocolate out of cocoa beans. Yes. Well, cooking obviously was a form of alchemy. And the earliest one of the early alchemists was Maria, and she came up with a mathematical formula, which is 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, 3 becomes 4, and 4 becomes 1 again. And I think one of the that's the theorem of Maria, and I think what she meant is 1 human being becomes 2 because we marry, becomes 3 because we have a child, and the 4th thing is we become something new as a family. And obviously, when you add children to a family, every new person changes the community. Every person in and every person out of a community changes it. And that's one of the things we have to think about. And that change is the alchemical change. um, making chocolate out of cocoa beans is a metaphor for alchemy. But as Jung understood it, alchemy was an early form of psychology. And so, um, wealthy people in the Middle Ages would send their sons to the alchemist to sit next to the fire and participate in these experiments that they were doing, and some of them were noxious, and that therefore, uh, changing the kids or giving them highs or something like that. And after they had apprenticed with the alchemist for a couple of years, they would come out and be uh, reasonably normal human beings. And the Norwegians, the Nordic people, had a similar approach, which was when kids were in their middle school years, like 12 to 15, they're often unruly, as I find as a school teacher nowadays. And it's it's best just not to interfere with that. So the Vikings used to just let these kids um, lie in the ashes in front of the hearth um, for a couple of years. And after they went through this sort of butterfly transition from a caterpillar to a butterfly, they would rise up and become Vikings. And so those are there are all kinds of ways of doing this alchemy, but in Western tradition, in Western Europe, people used to send their young boys, especially, to the alchemist, and they would participate in basically what became chemical experiments. And so that approach, the alchemist approach, became early chemistry. And at the same time, uh, and they thought that's all it was. And so they stopped teaching alchemy in the universities about, I would say, about 400 years ago now, in the 17th century, at least, maybe the 16th century. They stopped teaching alchemy in the universities. And so Jung came upon alchemy and started to realize that his world was the alchemist's world. And the significant part, because of the psychological changes which happened during these alchemical experiments. And um, and so when Richard Wilhelm came from China with The Secret of the Golden Flower, Jung could confirm that this was actually a human trait, that all humans had done a kind of chemistry that changed one psychologically as well as physically. Um, and so let's see. Uh, yeah, I'm gonna stop my mansplaining here and get back to uh, Mr. Pagai's essay here in a moment, but let's just see. Okay, so Richard says the Samaritans were the earliest practitioners of alchemy. I doubt that. But it wasn't known as alchemy, it was worship to the elements who were also their gods. And we can look at the Shinto faith of um, Japan, where everything was a god of some sort. And so people get married as Shinto because it's the alchemy of marriage. Um, and then they would become Buddhists when they approached their death. Um, yeah, I mean, Kathy says the first shamans, certainly there were shaman-like people everywhere in the world long before anything that happened in the biblical times. Uh, and Cherie says there are less examples to the centuries of Egypt of the first millennium AD. Well, I think it goes back way before that. It's just that we didn't have any writing or any historical information before that time. But if you go to Jerusalem, you'll find um, the Temple Mount, which is is holy to all three religions. The temple, the Wailing Wall, the West Wall, um, is the only part of the Temple of Solomon that still exists, but that existed for 1,000 years before um, before it was destroyed by various invaders. And today there's only the West Wall, and above the West Wall is Al-Aqsa Mosque. So all of the Abrahamic religions point to that area, which is probably a circle with a circumference, or I'm sorry, a radius of perhaps 3 miles at the most, maybe 2 miles. Very small area. You can be up on the road that goes around the caldera that Jerusalem sits in. Jerusalem's actually in a caldera of an ancient volcano, speaking of alchemy. Um, and you can be on that ring road, which looks out to the east toward Palestine, toward the west bank of the Jordan River, where part of Palestine currently is. And you can actually see the Sea of Galilee and at least where the Jordan River was, and it's all within view. So these things are not far apart in the Middle East. Um, but it's a very small area. I think it's more like 2 miles radius, a circle. If you set the circle to the center of the circle, it as where the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Wailing Wall are. Um, from that point, a 2 mile radius, draw a circle, and you have almost all the events of the Bible, or many of the events of the Bible, in at least the New Testament, because you have the Mount of Olives, you have um, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ's body was reputedly laying uh, after his death, and many other sites within that very small area. Um, Richard says alchemy was in all cultures, including the Americas. Yeah, I think it was, and certainly in cooking it was. Um, and and certainly medicine men and women, medicine women and men. My wife blueberry waffles for me this morning, and that was certainly alchemical and woke me up because I had maple syrup and so on. And so, these things have gone on for, you know, hundreds of thousands of years, not just recently, not just in the in the biblical times, but long before that, because human beings were doing stuff long before that. She says, it is here the earliest murmurings of Neoplatonism, Nazism, and this gold is called Chiswa medicines. Okay. So, in any case, I'm going to move on from this, but that's a long answer about alchemy. And so, Jung, in his time, when he was going through his Red Book period, he did have one alchemical text, and it had this phrase "salve et coagula" in it, which means to dissolve and coagulate. And what it refers to is to dissolve someone's ideas about who they are and what they are and let them come back together as something different. And after all, that's, if my understanding is correct, and I've never had therapy, but if my understanding of Jungian psychology is correct, what the analysts do is simply point out they dissolve your old ideas and let new ideas form in their place. And some people require more or less of that kind of alchemy. For John Beebe said to me that Jung was my analyst, and I guess that's right, because I've read so much of Jung that I pretty much have a pretty good idea of what his ideas were and how that has influenced me. And it's now been over 35 years that I've been studying Jung's work, and I can't get away from it. So obviously, it's very deeply affected me personally. Kathy says the highest form of cooking is in gold with the sun as the heat source. Well, that sounds great. Uh, okay. Arcofina says, do not let the Satanists hear this saying. They'll make an idol out of it. Well, okay. Um, uh, anyway, okay. I'm not going to be sharing recipes with you folks. But in any case, Jung became interested in what the alchemists had developed in the 1700 years of discussing alchemy. And so then he actually wrote a lexicon of alchemical terms. He started to study medieval texts and looked for alchemical terms. And he worked on this thing for about 10 years. Now, that I have not seen, the lexicon of alchemical words that he came up with. But he had done all that work. And so when Wilhelm came from China with The Secret of the Golden Flower, he immediately saw the connections. Okay. Duty to the dead. This is the next section. We're moving on. Jung's works are permeated with the topic of the duty of those alive to the dead. In 1916, at the height of the First World War, he wrote an imitation of the Gnostic treatise, The Seven Sermons to the Dead. The text explains to the dead the meaning of Abraxas, the deity of wholeness, so that they can find the way to peace. Gems with the images of Abraxas were placed on the chests of the first Christians so that their souls would be saved by Christ and that their bodies would be resurrected after his second coming. In the transition period, until Christianity developed its own symbolism and rituals, it actively borrowed elements of ancient cults and mysteries. It is known that on the altars near the images of Jesus were often placed the images of Dionysius, Orpheus, and even the famous wisdom teacher Apollonius of Tyre, to whom Vladimir Solovyov dedicated his first published article. When Christianity degenerated into an external structure of power and a social institution, and its doctrines became obdurate, it lost the ability to teach to the believers the meaning of Abraxas, that is, gaining wholeness. The importance of the Abraxas image, which is mentioned several times in the Red Book, is shown in the episode when Jung made a ring with the image of Abraxas, placed it in a glass of wine, and performed a magical ritual similar to the sacrament, giving his colleague Olga Freeby Kaptein a drink of it. Jung explained that Jung explained that the self-made him performed such a ritual. Okay, let me restate that. Jung explained that the self, his self, presumably, made him perform such a ritual. Since on the shield of Abraxas or on the side of the figure was usually written IAH, one of the names of Dionysius, Abraxas signifying the fullness of the cyclical transformations, was one of the aspects of this deity of death and rebirth. Although the theme of the dead echoes Jung's spiritualistic fascination, symbolically they mean the whole of humanity. The spiritual search of countless generations, their hopes and disappointments, inventions and revelations, constitute the contents of the collective unconscious. Every new generation must find answers to the problems left by the previous generations, i.e., the dead. Accepting the baton, we support the line of continuity. This gives us a feeling of rootedness, connection with the earth, ancestors, and kinship. It gives support to our identity. In Russian religious philosophy, there is a figure of Nikolai Fedorov, who exerted influence on Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Solovyov, and many others. His utopian teaching is an unusual mixture of Christianity with the faith in the progress of science. It is possible that he reacted strongly to the contradictions between religious and scientific worldviews and tried to reconcile them in himself. He considered the task of science to be the ultimate victory over death and the resurrection of the dead, thereby completing the missions of Christ. The direction of his ideas has much in common with the optimism of the Catholic theologian evolutionist Teilhard de Chardin, who also believed that scientific and technological progress realized the divine purpose. Fedorov can be considered a cosmic philosopher and futurist, the forerunner of the theory of noosphere and transhumanism. Although Federer's teaching, with his literalism of resurrection, resembles necromancy, it is based on the acute sense of lineal duty to the dead ancestors, which is extrapolated to all generations and all of humanity. He understands the Christian idea of the risen God and the victory of love over death as the task set before humanity by God to overcome the splitting between spirit and matter through the final spiritualization of matter and the reversal of the direction of the latter from destruction and decay toward an original integrity and unity. With the science and mysticism declared by him, Fedorov emotionally touches us exactly with his mystical faith. Jung did not reach such a scale in his relations with the dead and the kin, but Fedorov's feelings would have been close to his. Okay, I will revert to your comments further now. Let's see. Where is my... Okay. Shree says, I was listening to Shostakovich's Symphony Number 5 in D minor by conductor Ivan Rivenvisi and the meaning of this Russian music politically. Um, Good question. So why do people fear it? Uh, Kathy, stupidity, another bad rap, like certain dog breeds that have taken on scapegoat roles for periods of time. I wonder if Jung strummed strings or chords. Good question. That is that one I don't know. And I know that he was separated from music for a long time, and it was only in late life that a famous music teacher came and spent half a day with him to show him what she was doing with music to in terms of therapy. Okay, I'm you folks seem to have a small conversation going there, which I'm not privy to or not following carefully, so I can't really comment on it. Okay, the next section of this essay, and let's see how much further we have to go here. Not much, couple pages, and then we'll get to the conclusion. Reassessment of solar consciousness and deconstruction. Jung mentions in the Red Book a particularly important dream where he participates in the murder of Siegfried, being in league with a certain aborigine, a black man. Siegfried, whose name means conqueror, and who is the son of Sigmund, a child of Wotan, is an important character in the song of the Nibelung. It was he who killed the dragon. On a personal note, this dream refers to Jung's rupture with Sigmund Freud, who called him a blonde Siegfried, and at first prophesied to him the laurels of his chief heir, the crown prince of psychoanalysis. On the archetypal level, Siegfried is one of the typical solar heroes in mythology, abandoning the attitude of strengthening ego. The dominant attitude in the patriarchal, rational, extroverted, spiritual, and conscious culture of the times is important for solving the midlife crisis when the development of the opposite attitude is necessary for achieving balance. Therefore, the alliance with the Aborigine in his dream symbolizes an alliance with nature, earthy, chthonic, feminine, irrational, the union with the unconscious. In the Red Book, the solar figures are defeated many times. The hermit Ammonius, the prophet Elijah, the god Isdabar, whereas the dark figure of the magician Philemon is triumphant in the finale. Through the encounter with this image of the self, Jung learns to respect the mystery, to live in not knowing, to draw inspiration from myth and rational and irrational. But on this path of transformation, Jung is forced to go through suffering many times. In the Red Book, there are many destructive and cruel scenes, the meaning of which is in the deconstruction of the former personal attitudes. Remember what I was saying about alchemy and the lying by the hearth. Okay, this need to deconstruct not only their own attitudes, but all the outdated patterns of culture was acutely felt by Russian philosophers and creative people at the turn of the century. The main ideologist of anarchism, Mikhail Bakunin, declared, quote, "Destruction is creativity," unquote. The anarchists were the most powerful political force in Russia, playing a big role in all revolutions. Because of them, the label of anarchic and aggressive revolutionaries was fixed on European stereotypes toward Russia. Since Bakunin lived a considerable part of his life in emigration in Switzerland, having obtained citizenship there, it can be assumed that Jung was well acquainted with this understanding of destruction, and it could have affected his concept of psychological transformation. Another source of Jung's view can be considered in the concept of destrudo by Sabine Spielrein, who proposed such a name for the second instinct of the psyche, the opposite of the libido. It is believed that it was her ideas that prompted Freud to formulate the opposition of Eros and Thanatos. Sabine Spielrein, with her strange sexual and aggressive fantasies, was a typical representative of decadence with its deconstruction pathos. It was from decadence that symbolism was born as a movement in philosophy. Okay, just to make a current affairs um, reference right now, we see that the U.S. president right now is destroying many of the things that we once knew, including the White House itself, which is a very, very important symbol for the American people. And so uh, he sort of is the poster boy for destructionism. um, and I was mourning for several months, as most of you know. I was wearing black and mourning the loss of our country, the country that I fought for and served in the Marine Corps and have personally believed in for most of my life. And it was only as I came out of it and realized that with this destruction, we are called to create a new country. And that's what we have to do. And that's why I stopped wearing black every day. And it's sort of a putting my arm into the cudgels, my shoulder into the cudgels, and trying to move on and talk about what we need to do now, because it's obviously necessary to build a new country. And, there were plenty of problems and inappropriate things that happened um, in the 20th century, especially um, in our country, in the United States. And um, we now have a chance to rebuild our country without those mistakes. Obviously, that's suggesting that you could perfect something, but obviously it's an ongoing process. So Sharia is talking again about the Shostakovich uh, symphony, and uh, the first performance in political terms was the darkest and most terrifying period of trials and purges. Stalin was not only getting rid of his enemies, but cleansing society at every level, which, of course, we see our president trying to achieve today. He might find it a little more difficult uh, than he thinks. And they were also trying to cast Shostakovich out, but the music is brilliant. In today's society, who is doing what to whom? Well, I think in 20 years we'll probably know something. The principle of forgiveness, which is central in Christianity, is transformative and alchemical in the sense that you don't stay burdened by bitterness or regret. This is how we can become childlike. This is from Deborah in Australia. Having said that, we must also be courageous and not naive. All societies are being affected and traumatized. The age of Aquarius is a long-term arc. Aggressiveness, Cherie says, aggressiveness arises out of fear. And Deborah says, so we don't become bogged down by the objects of oppression, but engage in joy, laughter, and comic relief, which is very powerful. Um, and Archimedes is singing a mantra, which I think is from Hinduism. Kali Yuga, humanity will fade away. Kali Yuga, we are the cause of decay. Yeah, you think. And Deborah says, we still must be courageous. Courageous stuff like Krishna urged Arjuna to go in to do in the Mahabharata. And we know it here as the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna urges Arjuna to forge ahead, fight on. And when Krishna was whining and wetting about the fact that he was going to kill his kinsman, Krishna just said to him, don't worry, I'll give you new kinsmen. And of course, we see that happening in real time now in Palestine and with the Palestinians. So Snowman makes reference to Cherie's art and an event, and Cherie, I'd very much like to know about that. I don't know about it. And if you want to send me something privately instead of publicly, either way you can do it, but you can, here's my email address for anyone to use to write to me privately. There it is. And Cherie, I invite you to tell me more about your art, because I don't know anything about it, and you've been making wonderful contributions here for a long time, so I'm very curious now. And thank you, Snowman, for bringing it to my attention. Okay, I'm going to go on to the conclude and get to the conclusion here. Another derivation of decadence in the field of art came from the Russian avant-garde. It consisted of several diverse movements, among which the world famous became the Russian representatives of abstract art, suprematism, constructivism, and futurism. It is interesting that in the year when Jung had a dream about Siegfried and began to write his Red Book, Kazimir Malevich created his black square for the scenery of Mikhail Mityushin's cube futurist opera, Victory Over the Sun. The well-known poet Vladimir Mayakovsky also participated in the work of this group. The new cannot be built without the destruction of the old, it was said. The sun in the opera symbolizes the old order, the old worldview. Antithesis to the yellow shining sun is a black square or a black cube. The opera decisively calls the audience to stand on the side of the black square. In this experimental theatrical performance, the plot, the meaning, the costumes of the actors, the arrangement of the stage space, and finally the speech itself are subject to destruction, turning into an incoherent set of sounds. As in Jung's quest, we see here the expression of the need to release destruction for the sake of deconstruction of solar consciousness and the creation of a new, more balanced type of consciousness. So I draw your attention to the synchronicity here. The opera was staged again in Moscow in 2013, 100 years after its first production. Perhaps it reflects the connection of times the repetition of the crisis and the anxiety that accompanies it. Of course, the postmodernism of the late 20th century and early 21st centuries did much of what modernism failed to do 100 years ago. It weakened the tendency of phallocentrism, constantly renewed by capitalist competition. It taught that there can be not one truth, but many, or none at all. It taught us to appreciate more questioning, less affirming, to subjectivism, relativism, and pluralism. It introduced an element of irony, play, and relaxation. However, it is difficult to keep the attitude toward everything as jokes, experiments, and simulacra when vital problems such as terrorism or global ecological catastrophes become aggravating. In these conditions, in my opinion, the discourse of Jung and Russian religious philosophers saturated with a serious attitude toward destruction, and suffering on the way to finding new solutions becomes once again relevant. Okay, so that's the end of that section. I'll read the conclusion here in a moment. Sherry asks, this is a mystery to me. Are there any Jungian Black psychologists? And that's a very good question. I can't place one at the moment, but uh, I'm not suggesting there are not. Certainly, there are Japanese and Asian Jungian psychologists. Kathy says black minerals are associated with protection. Uh, okay. I think we can take good heart from this essay, and particularly this section, because it says again what we've been saying, that um, that our time may be filled with destruction, but there will be something new that will come in its place, and maybe we can hope better. Arcafana says, because as a company, I don't think BlackRock is nice. And Kathy says, rocks don't need morals. And so in any case, you have to make your own judgment about BlackRock. I have opinions, but I'm not going to share them here. And we'll see what happens. The U.S. is a very complex place, and I think that what is going on is that there are many things going on. There are probably hundreds or even thousands of different phases of human development being represented not only in the United States, but I know they are in India. I used to travel to India quite often up until 2013. I traveled there 44 times from 1993 until 2013. So that's a 20-year period. And during that period, I went to India 44 times. I had been there several times before, but these were my main visits during the business that I conducted in India. And I always saw that India was the 20th and 21st century overlaid over the 12th century and overlaid sort of post-war Japan, for example, because um, as most of you know, I went to high school in Yokohama in between 1962 and 1964. This was very shortly after World War II, and the roads were in very poor condition at that time. And there were lots of three-wheelers, three-wheel trucks, and three-wheel um, motorbikes and motor rickshaws, that sort of thing. And so when I got to India in business in 93, about 30 years later, um, I felt like I was transported back into that time of my childhood. So I felt very comfortable there, and that was ironically a very nice feeling to to be transported back to a time when I was very comfortable getting around in Japan as a 15 to 17-year-old youth. Um, you know, okay. All right. So I'm going to move on and read the conclusion of this essay, and we can have a further discussion about it. It's very short. Conclusion. At the beginning of the 21st century, we turn to the events of 100 years ago that changed the whole course of world history. The October Revolution of 1917 was preceded by an unprecedented flourishing of culture called the Silver Age or the Russian Renaissance. Today in Russia, many creative people continue to draw inspiration from the works of that period and are trying to maintain continuity with those great Russian thinkers of the past. Jung, during the period of writing the Red Book, was well aware of the spiritual quest of the Russian intelligentsia. In turn, Russian symbolists were actively interested in psychoanalysis in general and studied Jung's theories in particular. Therefore, one can talk about mutual influence. Their search was parallel in many aspects. They relied on Platonic philosophy, Gnosticism, occult teachings, and spiritualism. They acutely felt the collective neurosis, the general worldview crisis of the epoch, and tried to find an individual formula for its resolution. On this path, they created works of a synthetic nature where philosophical reflections were combined with poetry and prose, and sometimes with music, theater, and painting. They believed that a deeply personal, sensual immersion in myths and symbols is the best way to gain new meanings, both for the individual and for society as a whole. They tried to preserve Christianity as the basis of the identity of the European person. In this in the time of dominance of materialistic science, a religious attitude needs to be renewed in order to better meet the needs of the people. They considered religious philosophy and depth psychology to be the means for this renewal. Well, I certainly concur with this essay, and um, and the need for renewal. We do need renewal. Um, we we made sudden changes in the way we did things in the last half of the 20th century, which caused lots of economic heartache and grief, especially in what we call the Rust Belt in the United States. And there is renewal going on. It's not quite to the taste of everybody, but anyway, Richard says something very different about Russian Orthodox Christians. I've been listening to St. Elizabeth's Convent in Minsk a lot, and they have such simple but beautiful ways of life and no makeup fancy hairdos. Um, absolutely. Okay. Richard says, but they're so blissfully happy, and their piousness is beyond anything in the world. Um, yeah, I mean, in terms of happiness and just pure joy of spirituality, of all the countries I've visited throughout the world, and as most of you know, I spent 8 years of my life in Japan, and over 2 years, over 44 trips to India, and about a half a year in Saudi Arabia, and 23 trips there, not to mention many other, in total 12 Muslim countries, and so on. And most of the main European countries. Um, of all the countries in the world, and take a guess. I'm going to um, stop. I'll give us 2 minutes. I'd like everybody that's still with me here to guess what Skip thinks is the happiest country in the world. Absolutely the happiest country of the world. And I don't necessarily mean one that declares itself the happiest, but anyway, um, please on the YouTube chat, please put down the country of the world that you think I think is the happiest of the world, and I'll give you 2 minutes. I'll time it, and I won't proceed with any further talk until the 2 minutes has elapsed. Just please enter the country names. Okay, you have a minute and 5 seconds left to enter country names that you think I would say it is the happiest in the world. I'd be willing to bet dollars to donuts that nobody can guess, nobody knows. Okay, 20 seconds. Let's get all the guesses in there. Okay, 20 seconds, 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. There's some interesting guesses here, I must say. Um, and I wouldn't necessarily say all of them are abjectly wrong. They're all wrong from my perspective, but uh, so the number two happiest country in the world, and this is based on the testimony of my wife, who has been there, is Bhutan, Bhutan, and their king has declared that the country should live on the basis of gross national happiness. And so Bhutan gets my call for number two, but my number one uh, is one of the poorest countries in the world, and that's Bangladesh. And my reason for that is I've been to Bangladesh 5 times, and it's now about quite a while ago. It's now 30 years ago that I was in Bangladesh. But at that time, its average gross national income was $200 a year. And in Dhaka at that time, and I suspect that this is still true, there were about 200,000 pedicab drivers, people who were riding bicycles with a carriage behind the bicycle to carry 2 or 3 people, and they would take people here and there in the capital, Dhaka. And what amazed me about Bangladesh, and mind you that about half of it is really underwater. I mean, we talk about the Netherlands being the Low Countries, but about half of Bangladesh is really below sea level, and it and about half of it will flood very often during monsoon seasons in terrible ways. One of the main methods of travel is river ferries that run up and down the rivers of Bangladesh, and very often they capsize and so on. But what amazed me is that these pedicab drivers would go along driving their bicycle, and they had big grins on their face. They obviously were very happy about what they were doing, and it just amazed me. And I'll just tell one particular story that I thought was symbolic of it. The Goan Hotel in the center of Dhaka at the time was the most beautiful hotel in Bangladesh. It was a 5-star hotel, very nice. And but just beyond, there was a fence at eye level, and so patrons couldn't see past the fence if they were in the pool area. But there was a small village there of about 500 people who were living in huts made of old tin cans and all kinds of flotsam and jetsam. They had these houses that were very flimsily built, and Bangladesh is known for having sudden storms. And one day I looked out my 5th floor window, and I could see this village very clearly, and there was a terrible storm outside. And this village of 500 or so people was filling up with water, literally filling up with water. And I saw this little child who was about 4 or 5 years old come to the door of his hut, and he throws his hands up in the air in total joy and goes out and dives into the mud puddle. It was the most beautiful and joyful thing I ever saw happen, I think, in my life, was this little child diving into the mud puddle. And so, going back to some of your answers, Sheree, I do not know enough about Africa. I have, I wouldn't be surprised that there are very happy people in Africa. Um, and I have been to um, Zimbabwe and to Cape Town in South Africa, and I've been in Egypt. And um, yeah, I can't. Besides that, I can't really speak. But I would, I would observe that more things, having more things as we do in the United States, where we have, fancy cars and all kinds of stuff. I mean, even I drive a 2002 Honda Civic, which was given to me by my mother-in-law, but I find it perfectly adequate to drive back and forth to school, which is a 10 mile round trip each day, uh, total, 10 miles total, 5 miles each way. Um, and so it's perfectly adequate to get me back and forth to school. But most people um, feel that they have to have bling in order to be happy. And so, my kids, who are, many of whom are below the poverty line, think, oh, how could you be happy without a fancy car? And it just is not the case that things of any sort make you happy, at least not for me. And I've learned that you know I need things like I need art supplies and so on for my life, and obviously we need to eat. But I've found that people who are poor and who can just get by are often the most happy people in the world. And this is particularly true, as I say, in Bangladesh. And I take my wife's word for it about Bhutan. But anyway, let me just see what else is generated. It definitely is not Japan. Japan is a pretty uptight country, and um, somebody told me once that the Japanese are like the Germans of Asia, and the Koreans are like the Irish. and uh, and I think that that's sort of an apt comment. Um, and yeah, uh, Arcafina says that their flag is sick. I presume you're talking about the Bangladesh flag, which I don't care for, actually. It appears to be a rising sun like the wartime flag of Japan, but also very green. And anyway, and so Snowman says that after we talked about this before, that uh, she Googled it, he or she Googled it, and and it was Netherlands and Denmark. I do think that the that the Dutch are very happy people as well, and they've it's always been so, and they are the Dutch are very liberal people. You may remember that the Puritans of American fame, who settled in New England, um, wanted freedom from the British Crown to practice their own faith, which was very rigid and very structured. And they went to Holland for 10 years or so, trying to make a life in Holland where they could practice their faith the way they wanted to at a time when Henry VIII was beheading people that didn't want to be Church of England. And uh, they left Holland and came to the New World because they thought that the Dutch were too liberal for them in those days. And that was in the 1620s. And I think that things have not changed much in Holland, in the Netherlands since then. Um, and I know that the Dutch people are very joyful, and I am very pleased to often say that a quarter of my uh, grandparental parentage is from the Dutch strain of North America. Um, and ironically, a quarter is from the Swedish strain, and the Swedes and the Dutch during the 17th century were at war in North America. Uh, so it just goes to show how things change. Um, but I do agree that the Dutch people are very happy people. Um, and and I also agree that Lebanon and Palestine are not happy places right now. And let's see. Also Denmark. Yeah, I think Denmark is very happy also. Um, anyway, those are my reasons for thinking about which countries are happier. Um, and Snowman, I do agree with your observation about Japan there, that they work a lot and they're uptight. They forget to date and so on. Deborah says, clarification, Krishna instructs Arjuna to fight his cousins in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a part of the epic book of the Mahabharata. The Bhagavad Gita is an 18-chapter dialogue. Yes, and it's an 18-chapter dialogue which occurs in an instant of time, in probably less than 5 minutes, which I did not realize until I studied the Bhagavad Gita, and I've actually read the Bhagavad Gita online here uh, in three different versions. So I've read three. So when I read it with my friend Kushbu Kantaria, she read it in Sanskrit, and I read it in three different versions, and so it just depends on how you read it and think about it. But what I learned is that it's an instant in time that occurred um, 5,000 years ago and is described in the Bhagavad Gita. Um, uh, yeah. Um, Snowman says, don't get me started about Africa's situation with stolen resources. And if you want to know about stolen resources, uh, there was nothing worse than the British Raj, the East India Company's control of the Indian subcontinent, especially during the 17th and 18th centuries. And I urge everyone to read a book called Anarchy by William Dalrymple, which uh, really describes what this was like, because the British army that was in India was not the British army. It was actually an army that the East India Company was allowed to create, and it was quite brutal and quite awful, and a lot of a lot of the riches of the UK came from India, and I think a lot of those should be returned personally, including the Kohinoor diamond. And I can regale you for hours on stories about the Kohinoor diamond, but in any case, um, uh, okay, so he was talking about Bhutan's flag, not Bangladesh's, uh, which, okay, it has a dragon, but dragons um, are symbols of prosperity in Asia. So I don't think that that's particularly awful. I do have a theory that, um, the reason that so many humans believe in dragons and have images of dragons is because they actually ran into dinosaur bones that they couldn't explain at the time, because of course the dinosaur bones, um, dinosaurs became extinct about 65 million years ago, and so they couldn't explain these bones, but uh, they imagined these these, yeah, dinosaurs as dragons. And yeah, I agree with you, Archifaunus, about the Gita being a favorite book. Um, so Kathy says she just sent me an email about a first edition Bhagavad Gita that sold for more than $13,000. I would be very surprised if that's a first edition, Kathy, because the first edition of the Bhagavad Gita would be on scrolls or some sort of just parchment or something, and it would be 5,000 years old. So uh, I do acknowledge that an early printed edition might have gone for that, but I don't think it was a first edition by any means. Um, uh, Shri asks an interesting question. Why is Aldous Huxley an important writer? Well, I think that um, Aldous Huxley um, wrote about dystopia in a way that referred to the destruction and renovation of modern times. Um, and people could relate to it maybe better than they can relate to the total kind of destruction that we see in Palestine today. Um, and that's certainly a dystopian society now. Um, but but people don't understand the trials that the Palestinian people have been put together uh, for the last 100 years plus, 115 years or more. Um, because the British, particularly Winston Churchill, divided up the Middle East after World War One, and and then invited the European Jews who survived the Holocaust to take over or come to Palestine and basically take over in the immediate years after World War II. And that was not good for the Palestinians and hasn't been for all the time since then. And so they've resisted, they fought back. There have been multiple wars. Uh, the surprising one in my early lifetime was the Six-Day War. Um, and and so, I have very mixed emotions about all these things, because I have dear friends, and um, basically an adopted daughter uh, in Palestine, and I have dear friends in Jerusalem, uh, and um, and I have very dear Jewish friends here, but also very good Muslim friends in the United States as well. And so, based on my career, which was very international and very much aimed at Asia and Southeast Asia and South Asia and the Middle East, I feel that we just have to stop it and learn to live together and find ways to live together. And our president is trying to take us back to a time when the United States became dominant after World War II. And that time is gone, and it's no longer even appropriate anymore. So that's my view. And so Dre says, listen to his lecture, Rocco's lecture at the Venta Society in Southern California, Nature's versus Understanding of the Intellect and State of Education. Uh, I think all of us who are here on this weekly program are all basically there too. Um, Thank you. Well, I'm certainly feeling better. Last week, um, I was feeling put upon because I had been told that I had to do a an observation as a teacher in my school, and I my personal opinion is that special educators should not be asked to give a traditional um, planned lecture like a teacher is expected to, because the teachers in my school, for example, and I think this is true of most schools, um, have probably one lesson, certainly after elementary school at least. In middle school, from middle school on, teachers have one subject that they teach, and maybe they teach a basic and then an advanced form up or something like that. Or in my school, one of our teachers teaches geometry and statistics, for example. It's a very rudimentary kind of statistics, but nonetheless statistics. Um, and So most of the teachers are teaching one thing or at the most two things, and um, they do lesson plans for those two things. And usually when you do a thorough lesson plan, you can do enough to cover an entire week of material for your class. And in my case, I have to move from classroom to classroom as a special education teacher, and most of my co-taught classes are with you know children who have various disabilities, and my job is to work with those children, and so I actually am in classrooms that teach um, six different topics. Now, I am certified. I'm a certified social studies teacher, and I've been certified since 1968, although I didn't start teaching in K through 12 until 2022. But nonetheless, since 1968, I've been certified to teach social studies, and became permanently certified by virtue of my law degree in 1974 in New York. I had to take a praxis here, or two praxises here in Maryland, to be certified as a social studies teacher. I've done that, and I'm now certified in Maryland. Um, but um, to ask someone who has to go to six different classes on different topics. I teach in uh, ELA, which is English language arts, um, biology, um, geometry, algebra 1 and algebra 2, and social studies in my week. I have six different topics entirely that I have to be involved in teaching and helping my students with during a week. And in addition to that, I'm expected to do all the things that a special education teacher has to do these days, including things like individual education plans and meetings with parents, et cetera. It's a very complex job that I face as a special educator. And and a lot of the things that I do teach are special. Okay, they're special. They have nothing to do with classroom topics. And so to expect me to, stop everything I'm doing and develop a lesson plan the way a traditional teacher does. It's like being slapped across the face every time it comes up. And I do not like it very much. So last week, I was facing uh, doing this um, observation, which I did on Friday, the day before yesterday, um, and um, and I warmed to the topic, and I did do the lesson um, because I have to in my job, but I don't necessarily care for it. And last week I was feeling put upon, and I was quite tired. And ultimately, what I did was I took a sick day on last Thursday so that I could rest up and complete my slides and everything for my action plan. And um, what I created was basically a week's worth of material, given our student body. So, yeah, I was tired last week, and I'm feeling much better today. Um, well, Snowman, um, I took up K through 12 teaching when I was 75 years old, and that's a different kettle of fish than if you're doing it when you're 20. Um, and I don't know which is better, honestly, because I don't think that when you're 21 years old, you should be thrown in a classroom. I just don't think you know enough. I mean, anything you know at that age um, is is book learning for the most part, unless you happen to be in an overseas school. Uh, sure, you got to learn in Ojai, which is wonderful. And born in September 46, so you're a month older than I am because I was born in October 46. Um, exactly uh, one day before the conversation between Carl Jung and the rabbi in the play that I performed in. But anyway, you just don't have enough experience. And I heard one piece of advice, which when I was graduating from college, which was go out and do anything until you're 30. It doesn't matter what you do. You can go climb mountains. Um, and because nobody's going to believe in you uh, until you're 30. Now, the exception to that is um, is the military, where you can be a second lieutenant at age 21, and you do get quite an education before you become a field grade officer at about age 30, which is a major um, or a lieutenant commander. Until then, you probably don't have you're still a bit wet behind the ears, and you're given more and more responsibility. So I really do favor people having a military experience in their life because they learn to take responsibility very young and responsibility for other people. I mean, a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps is responsible for 50 Marines, and that's a big responsibility at that age. but we learn how to do it. I mean, we're trained to be um, the leaders that we are. Um, yeah. Um, so Cherie was in the upper end of the Ojai Valley, uh, and it was bought for the purposes. The school was bought by Mrs. Bisson, and interesting, very interesting. Um, and it was financed by Aldous Huxley. How about that? Roger Paul and Rosalind Roger Paul were there in the original trustees, and it was run by Rosalind. Now, one has to understand why I choose Aldous Huxley over George Orwell. Yeah. Um, well, that's interesting. I was interested in why you asked your question earlier, Shri, about, what the significance of Huxley versus Orwell. I think Huxley wrote Brave New World, if I'm not mistaken, whereas Orwell wrote 1984. Um, both of them scared the tar out of me when I saw them the first time as movies, or read them. I guess I read Brave New World in high school or something. Um, but hopefully our president won't do what happened in 1984, the book, the Orwell book, um, or Fahrenheit 451 or something like that. Now probably we do have adequate copies of the great books in various places and in various electronic forms, so it would be very difficult to wipe out books, as 451 Fahrenheit 451 suggests. But um, I do favor people getting very familiar with favorite books, and obviously I've spent a lot of time with the Red Book, uh, and my reason is that um, I relate very strongly to the events of Dr. Jung's Red Book period. And as I have said many times, I was taken over, I would say, by my anima in 1993 and ended up writing a novel um, at that time based on that experience. And it was only 16 years later that I learned that Dr. Jung um, had very similar experiences to me, um, and mine uh, mine lasted 8 months. Most of his took place in 3 months or 10 weeks, and I can't imagine the intensity of that must have been, and yet he was still taking therapeutic patients and so on during that time. So more power to him. But it was only when I read the Red Book that I recognized my own experience in Dr. Jung's experience. And they're on totally different topics, of course. Um, but um, but I understood what could happen to a person's psyche at that time. So that's why. Um, Yeah. What is November 20? Oh, yes. Okay. That was the date of the Kennedy assassination, of course, November 22nd, 1963. Um, that was waking up into a uh, very shocking period in American history. I was in Japan at the time, and I was in Japan at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis as well. And both of those occasions uh, caused the U.S. military to go to Defense Condition 1. My father was a naval officer. He was a commander in the Navy at that time. And so on both occasions, um, he disappeared for 3 days, and he didn't come back to the house for 3 days. Uh, and to this day, I don't know what he was assigned to do or what he did during that 3 day period. But I know that it was a terrible period for him. And some of my some of my friends had fathers. They had quarters for their families in Yokohama, but they were assigned to ships out of Yokohama or out of Yokosuka, which in those days was a 2 or 3 hour drive. Now you can get there in half an hour, I suppose, and you can get there within an hour on the train. But they those that were assigned to ships at that time that were in Yokosuka for various reasons were told to get to sea, and they got phone calls saying that they had to be that the ship was going to leave in 30 minutes, and they had to find a way to get to their ship, and the fleet did go to sea, and this shows how little our president knows, because he was talking about um, protecting our ships by, our combat ships by getting them into port. And that's the exact opposite of what you would do, because you don't want uh, the military locked up in a port uh, when there's when their purpose is to be at sea, if there's going to be fighting. Um, I don't know what the Gateway Project is. God knows what the new White House will look like. I don't think it's going to quite match up to what our previous understanding of that symbol of America will be or was uh, until last week. So anyway, I'm drifting and just talking randomly here, so I think I'm going to move on. And Sheree says, I just found in one of my Krishnamurti books a photograph of one of the loveliest women in film, Dorothy McGuire, and her dog Polo. Interesting. Uh, and Sheree had an opportunity to meet her several times. Um, yeah, very cool. Uh, Krishnamurti is a um, very, very interesting fellow, and I give him high marks on his life because he was discovered by Annie Besant on the beach of then Madras, now Chennai, India, and she developed him by sending him off to Cambridge and having him become a proper Englishman. uh, and all of which he rejected. He was a profound Hindu all of his life, but um, he was just filled with wisdom and an amazingly intelligent man. And uh, it's wonderful to have shared the earth at the same time that he was living, uh, because he was an incredible person. The only other one that I can uh, think match up to him is, and more than match up to him, is the Dalai Lama, who has lived for so long and has done so much around the world. Yeah, I don't think he liked Cambridge. He also didn't like what the Theosophists were trying to do to him, which was to declare that he was the new Messiah. And he finally went to a Theosophist convention in 1933, which happened to be his 33rd birthday. And they were going to declare him the new Messiah. And he got up to speak and said, "I'm not the Messiah. I'm nobody's Messiah, and I don't want followers. I don't have followers. I don't want followers." And the result of that was he had followers for the rest of his life. He couldn't get away from it, but he accepted it all in good heart. Anyway, um, I'm going to excuse myself. Nice chatting with you all, and we'll see you next week. And next week, we are going to be talking about India. India in the Red Book, overtones and undertones. Um, and it starts with Jung's lifelong relationship with India. Well, yeah, maybe. I think I had a few more experiences with India than he did, but nonetheless, he did make one trip to India in 1937 and was profoundly affected. And he got sick there and came home a better man for it. And so I look forward to chatting about some of my Indian experiences with in juxtaposition to Dr. Young's next week. So peace. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye. And by the way, if you want to join me in the panel so that I have somebody to talk to besides myself, I would be more than happy to welcome you on uh, the Zoom chat and join me here so that we can have a face-to-face conversation. So anyway, I hope you will. It's kind of hard to do it